Hello everyone and welcome to today's kitchen session, Using Psychology in Managing People at Work, delivered by Professor Ros Bramwell. My name's Grace and I'm a HE advisor here at the University of Chester, and I'm joined today by Katie and Hayley, who are helping behind the scenes today. I'll start by reassuring you that your video and your audio are not shared at all during the course of this session. In terms of how today will work, I'm going to be shortly handing over to Ros. During the presentation, you will be able to ask questions in the chat function on the right-hand side of the screen. You can ask questions anonymously if you wish. You just need to have ticked the box to say that you wish to be anonymous. You can also like other questions that people may have asked, and you can answer any questions that Ros may ask you just by responding in the chat function as well. And Hayley is going to be asking Ros all of your questions at the end of the session. So that's everything from me. I will hand over to you now, Ros. Thank you.
Thank you very much and welcome everyone to this Kitchen Sections short lecture which is really about how you can use the psychology that you possibly already learnt about in school and college and how that can be applied to the role of being a manager. And you might already be thinking, well, is this any relevance to me? So I'm going to ask you to think about that. First of all, will you experience being managed? And indeed, if you've done any part-time work or even any voluntary work, you've probably already had experience of being managed, although you may not really have thought about it in those terms. My next question for you is, who do you know who has manager as part of their role? So if you think about kind of family and friends, there may be people that you know who actually call themselves a manager, but there's probably many others you know who actually have that as part of their role because they oversee the work of other people, they're a team leader in some kind of way. And it's worth bearing in mind, if you're interested in studying psychology already, it's worth bearing in mind that you may have imagined yourself having a career as a psychologist, but that doesn't mean that you won't be a manager one day, because after all, as people's careers progress, they take on line management responsibility, team leadership responsibility with other people, and they become managers. Might you yourself be a manager one day? Well, I hope that you have the self-confidence, the interest, the ambition to think that that's a really realistic expectation for you one day, especially if you go on and study psychology yourself. So just to say a little bit about who I am and about who I'm kind of talking to here. So being a manager was kind of an unexpected part of my journey as a psychologist. I am passionate about psychology. I did my first degree in psychology, did a PhD in psychology. I've spent my career as a researcher and teacher in psychology, and I am absolutely passionate about the subject. And I never really saw myself personally as somebody who would become a manager, and that came about because, as I said, my career progressed and I got to that point where I was line managing other people, and now as I'm actually the strategic director for the School of Psychology, and so managing people is very much part of my job role. When I was preparing this short talk and thinking about who I was talking to, well, obviously this is a talk for anyone who's interested, but I was particularly thinking about year 12 and 13 students, and what I wanted to do in putting this short talk together was to talk to you about how some of the psychology that I think you may well have already learned about, if you've been studying O-levels, A-levels, perhaps for other qualifications like an international baccalaureate, the kind of psychology that you've already learned about, many of it the kind of classic studies in psychology, how could that be applied to the role of being a manager and indeed the experience of being managed. So that's what this talk is about. And as I go through, just highlighting a few different areas of psychology that are relevant to the role of being a manager, hopefully you will see that there are lots of the areas where psychologists that we think about, where we do research, where we generate and test new theories that are really relevant to the work that managers do. So I want to start by thinking about motivation. Again, I think it's very likely that if you've been studying psychology at school or college, you'll have learnt something about some of the classic research that's been done in psychology about motivation, motivation theory, what motivates people. And clearly this is very relevant to the world of work, where an important role of managers and team leaders is about motivating their staff. If you studied motivation, I'm sure that you will have come across Maslow's hierarchy of needs. This is classic psychology from kind of, it's almost like foundational psychology, isn't it? And as you will recollect, Maslow identified that we have a range of different things that motivate us in life. At the most basic, there's our need for things like food and water and sleep, and then our need for security, for knowing that we will continue to have things to eat, that we'll have safe places to be, that we'll have a home. But then that we also have what Maslow saw as higher needs within this hierarchy, needs for belonging and friendship, for a sense of self-esteem, but also to self-actualize, to exercise our intellectual curiosity and to be creative. And these motivators are really relevant to why people work. So when we think about why people work, do we think that people do that just for money? And sometimes that's a kind of idea that's presented to us, that work is all about going out to earn a living, to earn money. And yet I think when you reflect on it and apply the psychology you've learned, you'll realise that actually there's a lot more to it than that. Clearly people do voluntary work, they continue to work even when perhaps they've got enough financial security not to need to. People don't take the jobs that necessarily just pay the highest amount. And indeed, there's classic psychology research like the Hawthorne experiments that's very much about the fact that people are motivated not just to go to work, but to work harder and better, that are not just to do with monetary reward. And clearly people go to work because it gives them a sense of self-worth, and it allows us to do those things like exercise our intelligence and do things for other people, that kind of moral and ethical self-expression. And I think recent months have really highlighted for us the importance of belonging, friendship, companionship through work, because for many of us that's been much more limited in the period where lots of people have had to work from home. So moving on to think about communication, another really classic area of psychology and something that you may well have learned about in your school and college studies, but clearly also very relevant to the world of work. Now, I think you may be familiar with this, again, classic basic model of communication, that we can think of communication as being about a sender, a person who's trying to communicate something, and a receiver, the person who's being communicated with, who's, as it were, the receiver of the message. And the role of the sender is to take their ideas and to form that into a message which is transmitted and can be decoded. And clearly in this situation, I'm the sender. I'm giving this lecture and you are receiving that lecture. I'm trying to put my ideas into a form that you can understand. I'm transmitting that message for you to understand and receive, but the difficulties can be that that message is kind of distorted by noise, and that what you as the receiver hear isn't quite what I intended you to get from that. So thinking about how psychology can help us to think more about this process of communication, I'm just going to take a couple of different perspectives here. If we think first of all from the perspective of social psychology, we can think about sender and receiver characteristics. So things about the people who are in that communication and how that might impact on the ways in which they encode the message, the words we use, the kind of ways in which we convey that idea, perhaps through different metaphors, and the person receiving it, and the kind of aspects of us as people that might influence that process include things like our culture, our cultural background, our gender, the role that we're in. So, work situation, that might be people having different roles within the workplace. Also, the way in which we both encode messages and understand them is going to be very dependent on things like our previous learning and experience. That will dictate what kind of context we have to draw on when we think about how we're understanding a message. And our motivation, just to go back to motivation, can be really important in terms of, for instance, how we interpret things that are being said to us. Those things that we're very motivated about will focus our attention on those aspects of the communication. On the other hand, we can think about this from the perspective of what we learn from studying evolutionary and animal psychology. And that perspective can emphasize that communication is about much more than just words and language, and that there are also important forms of non-verbal communication which are going on. Things like tone of voice, facial expression, body language. I immediately at this point become very aware of the fact that I'm terrible for waving my hands around, so you've probably seen lots of that kind of body language from me already during this talk. So our communication can be aided by using additional communication channels. So as well as verbal communication, we can use written communication. And for instance, in giving this talk, I'm also using slides so that you've got the written word there as well. We can use visual forms of communication. And again, in giving this talk, I'm using not just words, but also including pictures and symbols and things to aid in conveying that message. We can use not just words, but numbers, which are also an important way of conveying information. How useful people find that can be very different between different individuals, and so helpful to be aware of those differences. And again, that can come from different learning and experience, can't it? And it's useful to think about the fact that a manager doesn't just need to communicate directly with the people that they're managing, that they're leading, but also to facilitate good communication within that team. So facilitating communication with others and between others is also an important part of communication. And it's useful to remember that when we're communicating, it can be really helpful to flip channels. So that, for instance, when we're conveying a message, to give people the opportunity to ask questions, and even to ask people to sort of say back to us what it is that they think that we've said to them, so that we can check that the communication has been effective. And of course, at the end of this talk, I'll be giving you the opportunity to ask me questions, and that's an example of flipping the channels. Okay, so now I just want to move on to thinking about shaping behaviour, and obviously psychologists are really interested in why we behave as we do, and how behaviour might be changed, what are effective strategies to make people behave in particular ways. And again, if you've already learned some psychology in school or college, it's very likely that you will have come across the idea of conditioning, classical and operant conditioning, as important ways in which behaviour is shaped and changed. So classical conditioning, which built on the work of Watson, this really highlights that we make associations between particular stimuli and particular behaviours, and that means that when we're exposed to particular stimuli, and that might be things like a particular environment, that we're likely to behave in particular ways that we've learned to associate with that environment. And that can very much help to explain the way that people will behave at work or in other places according to the context, the environment, and particular stimuli within that environment. Similarly, you've probably learned about operant conditioning based on the work of Skinner. And I think operant conditioning, again, this is real classic psychology, and it's a really good example of the way in which psychology as an evidence-based subject really shows us things about human behaviour that are kind of not what people just expect, not the kind of common sense view of behaviour. The common sense view of behaviour has tended to emphasise the use of punishment in order to shape behaviour, punishing people to stop them doing things that are not desired. Whereas operant conditioning really highlights how much more powerful it is to reinforce desired behaviours. That reinforcement doesn't need to be constant, it can be intermittent, and in fact intermittent reinforcement can actually be more powerful than constant reinforcement. But positive reinforcement of positive behaviour is a really powerful way to shape people's behaviour and to encourage people to behave in ways that are beneficial for society, for the organisation, or for us individually. And obviously this emphasises the potential for positive reinforcement to encourage useful, helpful behaviour in the workplace, and that can be a powerful tool for us to use. So I finally just wanted to reflect on the idea of the psychologist as the scientist practitioner. And hopefully throughout this talk you'll have picked up the importance of an evidence basis for our understanding of human nature. And so the model of the psychologist is this scientist practitioner model, where our understanding, our actions as psychologists should be based on good research and research-based theory, and that we should seek to actually evaluate the effect of what we do and reflect on it, so that we're reflective practitioners as well. So as a psychologist, I'm passionate about this idea of the scientist practitioner, that we base what we do on good evidence, and I think it's a really good model to take into management as well. So in conclusion, I hope that this short talk has given you some opportunities to reflect on the psychology that you already know, that you've already learned about, and how very relevant that is to working life in general and the role of the manager in particular, that you'll have seen that the psychology that you already know can have multiple applications. And maybe it's given you a hint as well of the fact that we never stop learning. So I feel that as a psychologist, as a researcher and a teacher, and now a manager, what really excites me about psychology is that I never stop learning, and that's been a lifelong experience for me, and I hope it will be for you too. So thank you very much for listening.
Thanks, Ros. That's really interesting, and I think it's really important for students, I think, to listen to a talk about, you know, how psychology can benefit different career sort of aspirations, because I think many people do think, you know, come to do psychology and be a psychologist. So I think it's really interesting to get that overview of how psychology can sort of, you know, help many different careers. There is a question that's come in, and it's had a couple of likes as well. So this is from Dylan. So how would you handle someone with low motivation and inner locus of control?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. Thank you. And I notice it's got two parts actually, because you're showing that you've also learned something about locus of control, which is a really interesting concept. And in some ways, one that actually I think often gets slightly misused. If you're sort of working with somebody who has low motivation, obviously a key thing is to begin by understanding why that motivation is low. It's interesting that you've talked about that in terms of where they feel their locus of control is. Locus of control, for those of you who aren't familiar with this, it's all about what our social learning, or learning from the people around us, has taught us about our powerfulness to sort of impact on what's happening around us. And actually, in many ways, having an internal locus of control is often a very good thing. So that wouldn't necessarily be associated with poor motivation. And actually it can be a good thing that people feel that they are in control, because you're more likely to do things if you think doing things is going to help you to make a difference. On the other hand, it may be that the issue is that what somebody's motivated to do and to effect isn't in line with what I want them to do. So it's not that their motivation is low, but it's for the wrong thing. So again, understanding what it is that people are motivated to do, so that you can look at how you can find things that are going to motivate them, but that are also going to motivate them to do things that are useful to the organisation. So that's a very short answer. I'd love to give it longer, because actually I'm really interested in locus of control as a concept, but perhaps we can have another kitchen session on that another time.
Thank you. So there are a couple more questions that have come in. So there's an anonymous one that says, as someone with Asperger's, I found your slide about sender encoder and receiver decoder very interesting. As receiver, I tend to get stuck in the noise without decoding. Has any research been done in this area?
Oh gosh, I wish I could give you a fuller answer on this one. But unfortunately, that's slightly outside my area of expertise. And it's such a shame, because I do have some colleagues who know a lot more about Asperger's and other neurological differences. And I think you're right to highlight actually that you know, if I'd had more time, I might have talked about neurological difference as being an important, another different perspective that we can bring to understanding sender-receiver communication. So yeah, I think the answer is lots of interesting research has been done, but unfortunately I'm not the right person to ask about it.
Excellent. So I think to that person, if you want to drop me an email, so I'll put my email address in the announcement bar at the end. You know, I'm sure we can get somebody who can perhaps drop you an email about that. Next question then, Ros. So what would be a suitable reward for desirable behaviour in an office or professional workspace?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. And I guess, you know, the starting point would be to say, first off, let's remember how powerful praise can be. Praise is probably powerful because of actually we've been conditioned to associate praise with other rewards. So it's an interesting example of how the reinforcer can itself be a kind of conditioned reinforcer. So praise often, but also again kind of being, it's really helpful to be aware of what's particularly positive reinforcement for that individual. You know, there are other things that can be really reinforcing. We're social animals, and so sometimes just, you know, giving people our time can be a very positive reinforcer for them. And obviously, you know, there are ways in which we all reinforce each other regularly during the day. Now, I do have some colleagues who are very keen on the power of cake, and I'm sure Hayley's going to but then I also work with some other colleagues who are keen to point out that we should be thinking about healthy eating as well. So
all the way, Ros.
So yes, there are lots of very effective ways of reinforcing behaviours that are quite simple, like praise, giving people our time, and just being aware of what's reinforcing for that particular individual.
Excellent. So I think we've got time for just another couple of questions. You talked about motivation and how that's important for people. What in particular motivates you?
Oh, do you know, that's a really interesting question, because it's one that I've really reflected on over recent months. I think I would have previously have pointed mostly to my love of my subject, and I do genuinely think that for me kind of intellectual curiosity has always been a really important motivator. But I would say that perhaps particularly through the last few months, I've become even more aware of just how important my work colleagues are for me, and how much I feel motivated to go to work, to perform well at work, to just by the collegiality of my colleagues, and also by my interactions with my students, which have always been a huge motivator for me. You know, I would say that over the years, I feel that in different ways, I've learned probably as much, if not more, from my students as they've learned from me, and that's a huge motivator for me.
Thank you. So last question, I think, then, unless any others come in over the next minute. Do you think psychologists make better managers?
Well, that's a difficult question. Again, there is quite a lot of really interesting research on what makes a good manager, and a lot of that is about personal qualities that perhaps, you know, we can't claim that psychologists have more than other people. But I guess what I would certainly say personally is that I would say that understanding psychology, knowing about psychology, makes people a better manager, even if psychologists aren't better managers.
Thank you. So there aren't any other questions on the chat, so I'll hand it back over to Grace. But thank you very much, Ros. That was really interesting.
Thank you, Hayley.
Thank you, Ros. That was brilliant. Thank you so much for such an interesting session as well. That does round up everything for today's session, and we hope that everyone watching has really enjoyed the session and found it really useful. We are running many more of these sessions throughout the rest of the month, so do check our schedule on the website and sign up for any others that take your interest. Thanks again, Ros, thanks Hayley and Katie, and thank you everyone for watching.